Welcome to video 2 in this series of 4 in this Microsoft SharePoint 2010 and Visio workflow demo. In the previous video I created a expenses list in SharePoint 2010. I'm now going to, in this video, create a visual representation of the workflow I want to use on this list in Visio 2010. My workflow is going to be a simple workflow that checks the value in the expense value column. If the value is under £100, the expense is automatically sent to be approved by the expense approver. If, however, the value is over £100, a task is sent to the original user asking them to fill in some additional details about the expense and explain why it's over the limit of £100. Here we have Visio 2010. When you open the product, this is the first screen you will be greeted with. As we can see, we have a template called Microsoft SharePoint Workflow Metric. This is the one we are going to be using. It's in my recently used template section. However, if you are new to the product, to find this workflow diagram type, click on the flowchart option, and then from there you will find the Microsoft SharePoint workflow diagram type. Double click this to open your diagram options. Within Visio we have the ribbon option. We also have, on the left hand side of the screen, a list of the different shapes we can use. These shapes correspond to the different actions, conditions and terminators that we have in SharePoint Designer 2010. Anything that we create in our diagram in Visio can be replicated in SharePoint Designer 2010 with some configuration. To start our workflow, we must first take the Start button from the Terminator section, add that to the top of our page, then take the Stop or Terminate option and add that to the bottom of our page. Doing this will help us to design our diagram better, as we will be able to make sure everything flows and ends up connecting to the Terminate option. The first step in our workflow involves comparing the value of a field in our list. To do this, we are going to use the Compare Data Source Diagram option. To use this on the page, I drag and drop and add it when I want on the page. To give some extra detail to my diagram option, I double click the text in the middle. As we can see, the text has now been highlighted and I can add in a description of what the steps should do. So we are going to check if expense value field is greater than £100. If we select the box again by clicking on it, we can use the arrows to the right hand side to expand the shape to allow the text to fit in. We then move this across to align it. We have now added our first step to our workflow. We have two options from this step. Our option 1 is the expense is less than 100, therefore the expense is sent for approval straight away. Our other option is if the expense value is greater than £100, we have to collect some extra data from the user. To represent the split in possibilities when we are designing our Visio diagram, we are going to create two separate strands for our workflow that run in parallel with each other. They will be separated by a yes/no option. We will come to this later when we add our connectors in our diagram. Our next step is to design our action we will take if the expense is less than £100. If the expense is less than £100, I'm going to automatically start the approval process. To do this, I'm going to drag my Start Approval Process diagram option from the tool pane and drop it on my page. Again, just as before, I'm going to double click the box to add some text, and I'm going to add into here, send expense for approval. After the workflow has been sent for approval, that is the end of our workflow. We don't need to add any further steps to this side of our workflow. We can now look to complete our workflow for if the expense was greater than £100. In the case that the expense was greater than £100, we're going to collect some data from our user. So we're going to use this diagram option and drag and drop that from the tool pane and drop that on our page. Again, double click on the text and add in request further details from user. Once we have gathered these extra details about the expense, we're then going to send our expense on for approval with the information gathered from the user. So the next stage in this workflow process is to add our Start Approval option. And again, double click, send expense for approval. We now have the different stages in our workflow. The next stage in our workflow process is to join these different workflow diagrams to display how the workflow will flow. To do this, we're going to go to the ribbon and use the Connector option. To connect our items, we have to hover over our first Start button until a red box appears around it. This means this is selected. And then press and hold and drag our connector down to our next diagram item until the red box appears around that. These items are now glued together. I now need to draw a line between the check if the expense value field is greater than 100 and the send expense for approval. I then need to do the same on the other side with our request further details from user. We have to tell our workflow what action we want it to take at this point, the check if expense value field is greater than 100. If our expense value is no, if it's less than 100, we want to send expense for approval, so we're going to set this line as being no. On the other side, we're going to specify that this is yes. Check if expense value is greater than 100, yes, if it is, take this course of action. I'm now going to join my next stages of the workflow, and finally add them to the terminator. And my workflow has now been created. To check the workflow, click on the Process tab from the ribbon, then click on the Check Diagram option. As we can see, our diagram validation is complete and we have no issues. Press OK. Once we have completed our workflow diagram and we are happy that it fully represents the workflow we are trying to design, click on the Export option from the ribbon under the Process tab. This exports the Visio diagram as a special file type which can then be imported through SharePoint Designer. We're going to name our file Expenses Workflow and then hit Save. We can then save our diagram as well. That brings us to the end of video 2 in a series of 4 of how to create a SharePoint workflow diagram in Visio and then export it into SharePoint Designer before finally adding it to the site. In my next video, I will demonstrate how to import the workflow we have just created into SharePoint Designer and how we can then configure it to make sure it works properly.